Okay, so I would like to respect your time this evening. So I think we will get started. We may have some folks connecting later. So for those who may not know, I'm Marianne Hladun. I'm the Regional Executive Vice President for the Prairies. And tonight we also have with us Lindsay Sparks, rep from the Calgary office, who will be assisting. And we have Darren Passioni from the negotiations branch that will be giving you some information around bargaining shortly. So before we begin, as we always do, I would like to do a land acknowledgement. So tonight we have members gathered from all three provinces, and I'd like to acknowledge that I'm currently joining you from Treaty 1 territory, which is the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. We also acknowledge that in the Prairie region, we gather together from Treaty 4, Treaty 6, and Treaty 7 lands and the homeland of the Métis Nation. We are dedicated to ensuring that the spirit of reconciliation and all treaties are honored and respected. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. So I'd like to welcome everyone. What we're going to do tonight is Darren is going to give you an overview of what makes a good bargaining demand and what's a weak bargaining demand, but also what happens after you submit a demand. As we're getting ready for Treasury Board bargaining, so you still have an opportunity to put forward proposals for consideration by the bargaining team. That is up until mid-November. So we wanted to give folks an opportunity to kind of think a little bit about how you frame your proposals. After Darren's done, we'll have time for questions. If you have questions, if you want to put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and then Lindsay will go through and kind of call out the questions, and Darren or myself will be able to answer. You know, if we need further clarification, we can open your mics and invite you in if you have more questions. So I think on that, I'll welcome Darren to the Prairies, although you've worked with many Prairies locals and is very familiar. So I'll turn it over to Darren for the presentation.
Thank you very much, Marianne. Everyone should, I'll just check that Marianne and Lindsay, you can see my screen, presumably so everybody else can.
Yes, you're good.
Excellent, thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for the introduction and the welcome, Marianne. I really appreciate that. My name is Darren. I'm a researcher in the negotiations section, and I'm here to talk to everybody tonight about how to write a good bargaining demand for the upcoming round of Treasury Board bargaining. So what we'll do is my slides are going now. So what we're going to walk through is calling it the demystification or demystifying the process, what makes a good bargaining demand, and what it means to write that demand. Basically, I think that if this is, whether you've done this through multiple rounds, 2, 3, 4 rounds of bargaining, or this is your very first time, I think it's always a really good idea to think about a lot of the principles that we're going to talk about tonight around strong bargaining demands, weak bargaining demands, what makes a demand that makes its way through the process and gets considered at the bargaining conferences, and the types of discussion therein. And as a researcher, the one thing that I'm going to share too is the sort of thinking about the rationale and the data behind it from the perspective of somebody who reads a lot of bargaining demands over the last several rounds of Treasury Board bargaining. A little bit of background: I've been at the table with the Operational Services Group, the SV group, as well as the Border Services Group, the FB groups, through 2 cycles of bargaining each. So so that's just my background going through this process. So this will be my 3rd round of Treasury Board bargaining and working with teams and even giving this presentation. And also at the end, we're going to look at examples of actual demands that have come through. So, demystifying the input, the first piece. So, the members play a crucial part in the bargaining process because this is where the demands are where the mandate begins to form. This is where our bargaining power begins to take shape. This may not be the last, like this submission. These submissions will be viewed throughout. I remember looking at bargaining, even being at the end of last round of bargaining, going back to input documents, looking at rationale for that little extra bit of context if you need to pull something forward or get that little extra bit of original sort of like thinking behind it. So that's why these the framing and the clarity around the demands and the rationale that is used to support them is so important. The teams really rely on it. So the input process. So I'm going to say a lot here and try to give a sense of like what this looks like, especially if it's your first time through. So the collective bargaining, again, collective bargaining is a fundamental democratic process, beginning with the membership, beginning with this input. It is the primary resource of the setting up of anchoring the proposals and doing the research and collecting the data and developing the mandate around this. This is what the input does. The members are the experts. They're the experts because they're working, they're on the front line. They are working in the workplace, at the work sites, talking both to each other, talking to managers, dealing with the day-to-day problems, dealing also with day-to-day service in the public sphere, in frontline, the frontline work with the public. So those are the types of stories and rationale that really inform. It's that close look at the day-to-day that can really inform strong input here. So to go to a piece of the slide, the input comes again from the members first. Depending on the size of the bargaining unit, we're talking about Treasury Board bargaining here. So these are fairly large bargaining units. So depending on the size and the constitution of the components, I'm not sure of all the components represented by the members here or that the members are a part of here, but input is sometimes reviewed by the local and signed off by an officer of the local. It then, in some cases, it then makes it up to the components, and I'll kind of talk about that in a bit. But the input call, this process began back in May this year, May 2024, sort of the beginning of the earlier in the summer. I guess late in the spring, not early in the summer, when it was posted on the website. And we have until the late fall, November 15th, 2024, to submit input. So that's why these sessions on assembling input are so important right now, because we're talking to members about this process while this significant window is open, and engaging on what this looks like. So once the input is submitted, it's reviewed and filtered and translated through the components. Then the input is forwarded to the negotiation branch of PSCC. So that's where the section where I work. And as a researcher who works with the negotiators, we begin to categorize and assemble the bargaining input for the bargaining conference forthcoming in the new year. And what do we mean by categorize? So this categorize is we're basically building these bargaining booklets that look at things and put them together related to, are they leave related? Are they compensation related? Are they monetary proposals? Are they about union rights? Are they about sort of grievance and arbitration processes? All of these get categorized in grouped together, so there's a sort of a coherent flow to the bargaining conferences that occur. So and the importance of that demand, or the importance of that categorization process, is we also aligning them thematically, we can identify commonalities and conflicting ideas and ensure that the discussion and the debate about the demands and their rationale occurs in a fulsome and supported process. So in this case, the researcher and the negotiator will be working with the delegates of the bargaining conference, a bargaining conference at which the bargaining teams are elected, but we'll be working with them to have these discussions. Some of us will have experience from previous rounds. Some of the delegates will have experiences from previous bargaining conferences, or perhaps they were team members before. So all of those sort of experiential things will lend itself to understanding and discussing the bargaining input, and leading then to the formation of proposals and the tabling of those proposals and the negotiations at the table themselves. That's where the fight kind of begins to happen, based on all this discussion, based on this input. So that's kind of like the trajectory of like the formation and the submission of the input and the processes that it goes through to be on its way to becoming bargaining input or bargaining proposals in the booklet of proposals at the table. So that's the sort of why we're putting in this work now. So what makes a good demand? Talk about good demand, bad demand, but what we're talking about is how do we put the best foot forward with this, or the best proposal forward, the best ideas forward for the to assemble the bargaining proposals. What features make them stronger than others? Maybe something that is written without clarity or written without sort of evidence won't get as much attention as something written nice and clearly and with some interesting supporting evidence. Sometimes we see, I've seen all kinds of bargaining, but sometimes there's something that somebody feels is really obtainable. Of course, it seems so obvious. But when it kind of makes its way to the table, it's something that isn't permitted to be bargained in the bargaining process, or it is something that is just not something that people don't feel is feasible given like the types of rounds. But that's what I think the importance of thinking about how to write these demands in the most clear way really adds to that. So I'll start with what makes a weak demand before talking about what makes a strong demand. The 4 points that you see here, and I'll kind of speak to each of them methodically. You'll see issues that what we call are enforcement issues, what we have as illegal demands. I'll get into that in a moment, and maybe it should have been in quotes. The demands that aren't supported by evidence and demands that aren't written clearly. Those are the things that we've talked about as being more weak demands. So enforcement. If the existing language is weak and members end up with problems that can't be addressed with the existing language, that's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is situations where the language is strong, but members aren't, in a sense, like standing up for the language as written. It's a manager just isn't following it, and we're not calling that manager to account, for example. That's what we mean by enforcement. Maybe that means that a grievance or an informal discussion with a manager could actually resolve the problem, and we see that rather frequently. A team member in like at another bargaining unit, whether it's doesn't have to be Treasury Board, the Treasury Board units, but they'll say, oh, like this isn't happening, even though it says it is. And it's like, well, like it says it should be happening in XYZ process, but it's not happening because we're not holding that manager to account. Perhaps we need to get a steward to talk to the manager to resolve this interpretation. Maybe the manager doesn't know. I mean, perhaps that's being generous, but maybe there is some inexperience, or maybe it's a bad read, and we need them to be accountable, and we need to challenge that in a formal way with the grievance. So those are the types of sometimes a demand. The language is sometimes we see input where the language that already exists is rather strong, and we need to just make the language work for us. It's not the language. My colleague who assembled some of these notes made this really great point about it's not the language itself that has the power. It's the members who have the power to enforce that language. So I'm kind of maybe I'm going on a little bit at length at that piece, but that's actually really important. Making sure that your contract, that your employment contract is being enforced as written is one of the fundamental, in some ways, the fundamental roles of the work that we do in the union. We also work to improve it, but ensuring that it is serviced and ensuring that that language works for the members as it is written is very important. So what do I mean by illegal demands? So basically, these are demands that we can't bargain at the bargain. We can't bargain classification, so separate processes to engage with classification discussions. There's dedicated experts, a classification grievance processes, for example, but we know classification does continue to be problematic, and a lot of people on this call may even have concerns about that, but unfortunately we don't have the right to negotiate classifications under law. Instead, we tend to focus on negotiating wage adjustments and getting occupational group structure reviews is one of the things that has been done about that. But we can also improve grievance rights related to classification issues. I mentioned grievances before. So although the topic or the concept itself is not negotiating, we kind of negotiate the accountability structures around it, such as the grievances. Another example is the dental and healthcare plans. So the dental and healthcare plans exist as National Joint Council directives. So the dental and healthcare plans and other National Joint Council related demands, like the bilingual bonus or the isolated posts in government housing directive, they are negotiated in other forums beyond the bargain. They're negotiated in other forums outside the bargaining table. Article 7 of the collective agreement speaks to the NJC provisions or the NJC directives that form part of the agreement. However, the bargaining of those, and how it is called the cyclical review, has its own bargaining input, has its own input process as well as a negotiation process. So those are what are meant by illegal demands. Pensions is another example of one where the law prescribes that we can't bargain changes to the act, for example. The other two, so demands that aren't supported by evidence. What does this mean? So like this one hits home for me. This one really hits home for me as the researcher. I'll often sit beside the negotiator at the bargaining table with the team, with my spreadsheet up and my laptop open and my spreadsheet up, kind of going through like the evidence that we've assembled on our way to the bargaining table, and the input that is supported by evidence or little pieces of data are so fundamentally helpful. Sometimes I'll call this, it's like if we just have one anecdote, it isn't as strong. Two, three, four anecdotes begin to form a story, begins to form some qualitative evidence. Stories that are connected to numbers and data, and we can begin to count, and we get that quantitative evidence. So those are the types of things that become very helpful when we're beginning to develop. And I'll talk about how those things further aid building a strong demand in a moment. Finally, demands that aren't clearly written. So something that is clearly written and supported by evidence is going to get a lot more attention in the when it's going through the component and bargaining conference and bargaining teams. They may struggle with something that isn't really clearly written. And we'll look at some examples of that as we move through the presentation. Again, delegates are from all types of departments and positions. So this is people at the bargaining conference who fellow members of the bargaining conference that'll begin reading this rationale and this input and these demands. And they're going to come to read these things without the same experience as you have. So again, sharing from your position of power as somebody on the ground in the workplace and describing that really is helpful, because not all the members at the bargaining conference will have the same information about those work sites and about those contexts and situations as you may. So that's where, again, being as clear as possible in those descriptions of what the demands are is so important. While every member of the bargaining unit may submit a demand, not every member can go to the bargaining conference. If you have a proposal and support it with evidence, comparators, those types of things, and if you include this in the rationale, it'll help the delegates understand, even if you're not at the bargaining conference, it really helps move that conversation at the bargaining conference. So let's take a look at what makes a strong demand. Let's switch over to, we talked about sort of things that weren't as, we'll talk about the ones that are what makes a strong demand. So the three sub points here: changes in the workplace, demands that address changes in the workplace. Then the second one is reasonable requests that are being unreasonable denied by management, and demands that replace weak language when we have lost grievances because of that language. So those are sort of three headline points that make strong demands, because we're talking about workplace problems and member needs. So again, these are in instances where there's significant changes in the workplace that have occurred during the life of the agreement. So we call that the close period before the agreement expires. Are some things that are really valuable. A good example is last year, wildfires in the north of the provinces and in the territories are a good example. We saw demands about evacuation. We didn't see those types of demands in previous rounds, but they came out in the midst of at that point in time, and then became a much more it was a salient demand because of the current context. Technological changes are also, as the work environment changed, new protections may suddenly be needed. Things can move quickly, and the contract expires only on a certain date. So demands that react to those changes are really valuable, and they help. They form really strong proposals. In the third point, where we talk about weak language, replace weak language when we have lost grievances because of that language. In this case, we're looking at language that tries to challenge or stop unreasonable exercises of management rights. If we've lost grievances, and again, like you will know if that is happening in your workplace. Language that responds to that can be very valuable. Even pointing to a specific grievance or a specific context allows us. It can be, if you have a grievance number, even that could be something that we can look up later, and that can be leaned on. If you were a steward or you are a griever yourself, and had a grievance denied because the language was weak and unclear, this could be a good idea to submit a demand on that helps clarify the problem where maybe the current language became a blockage in the course of pursuing the outcome that the griever or the steward was looking for them, or that member was looking for. So we talked about ones that are rooted in workplace problems and kind of gave three examples. Now let's talk about ones that are rooted in momentum building exercises. So what does that mean? These could be things that are part of ongoing campaigns. Grievance campaigns, that's something that isn't mentioned here, but ongoing grievance campaigns often are a good source of sort of thinking and developing new language. The union is lobbying, letter writing campaigns. They're really important because it shows solidarity and it builds union power, but it also says, you could say something like, the union submitted like 1,500 letters on this topic. This is a very, like, the members demand this. And they went to their local member of parliament in the Saskatchewan constituency, and we're demanding this. And then maybe we can go and maybe this created a bit of stir in question period. Maybe this at Parliament, or maybe this kind of it was connected to a study at parliamentary committee. We can go and pull that evidence, and you can get to see, you sort of build on that momentum of what's being done. That work on the ground can have that stirring impact that causes sort of that ripple effect that can be traced and then pointed to specifically at the bargaining table. That's what I love to do, is when I can trace back a campaign or member input to something that is happening actively in Parliament, in the legislature, or in the Senate, and kind of. I know that may seem big picture, but we really I do see those things as connected. That's where we see that means that momentum has built, or that momentum is building and/or is built, and that is powerful. And we can use that when we're at and that can be used at the table. the bargaining team can use that at the table. Because we do track that, the impact of it. The second sub point here is in-depth studies. So I'll use an operational services SV group study, but in 2010, the Canadian Senate studied light keepers on light stations in BC and Nova Scotia and Newfoundland. And that became, and I know maybe that's not really topical necessarily for discussion with members from the Prairie, but it was an example where the Senate actually produced a study on light stations and light keepers. And that became something that reflected member context and member needs. And I know, for instance, there's been call center studies, different things and different tools like that. So again, if your demand can reference, say, something, and it doesn't have to be like exactly the exact citation, but it's like, oh, there was a study in the community, or a local study, or that we know that the union, or we know management did an audit. I heard about this audit that management did. Those are different ways to do it. A lot of the times, departments will conduct audits. I'm not sure the departments represented by the member, or that the members here today work in. But I know that many of the big government departments, they have internal auditing groups, and they often produce studies about their various the effectiveness of certain things, whether they're looking at service standards or performance indicators. Sometimes they can help tell a story about the working conditions, or short staffing, or recruitment and retention needs, right? When it comes to building momentum, you're also building a story. And these little pieces help tell that story. And that story can then be a powerful tool at the table for the team. The third point here is so things that can be addressed by the union management committee. So if you're on a local committee, you very well may know what the issues are at the local, and maybe a step higher that the issues are at in the department, or within a constellation of locals in your region. Maybe there's those regional committees. So the sort of common problems may be something that can certainly lend itself to putting a strong piece of input forward. One thing I can tell you too is that sometimes when you're at the bargaining table with the team, the question comes up, oh, was this looked at the union management committee meeting? So input can come from that, but also further evidence can come from that. So there are also, again, powerful spaces where the topics discussed at these union management committee meetings become spaces where input can grow from it, and further evidence can also grow from. So that's, again, I'm kind of thinking about all the different places that members can lean on and turn to when looking to develop bargaining input and writing strong demands. Okay, next. So I'll flip back again because I like to tag what we've just done. So we talked about demands rooted in workplace problems and member needs. We talked about demands with momentum. Now we're talking about demands based on precedent. What does this mean? We're always looking to build on what other bargaining units and other unions have negotiated, and just as they build on what we've negotiated. Sometimes I call this sometimes external comparability or comparability. We compare ourselves to other workplaces. If Parks Canada and Environment Canada have two different sort of ways of doing something, maybe this isn't a good example, but oftentimes we lean on the strong examples of one collective agreement to build on the examples of another, or other unions can lean on that. Sometimes we try to adopt the best language and move that forward, and sort of build on strong comparators. We can always make compelling arguments for parity with other bargaining units. If we knew that, for example, a PIPS agreement had a higher shift premium, for example, than the PA agreement, we would say we want parity with this other federal public service collective agreement. Treasury Board, you are the ultimate employer, so we want to match that parity. That's how we sort of build and look for good precedents out there. So that's a way that we can. in the research section, we try to audit that the federal public service and make sure that we're always advancing the best. But sometimes other members will point, sometimes members also point to ones external. They're like, oh, this local in Saskatchewan does this, or this all local in Alberta does this. We have for at the SV Operational Services Collective Agreement. Here's a better example. Last round of bargaining, the firefighters, the 500 or so firefighters wanted parity with the municipal firefighters near the D&D bases. There's a 20% gap. That parity argument was actually rather powerful for that, because it's the employer right next door pays this much more, same training, same duties, same responsibilities. That's the type of what it was based on. A precedent, it was based on a comparison to another collective agreement, and those were municipal collective agreements with another union. So these are the sorts of things that can help build when we're talking about precedents. And keep in mind that changes to collective agreements often happen incrementally. They can happen, and some of the times they happen slowly over time. Often we're not breaking new ground and making very significant gains all at once. It does take time. It isn't often that we have breakthrough, was the word I was looking for. Breakthrough successes right off a new idea. Oftentimes it begins sort of like you build a foundation upon which further gains can then be made. So the format of the demand is next. So after we talked about precedent, we talked about momentum, and we talked about workplace challenges and member member needs. What is the format of these demands? The demand has two parts, or the input has two parts: the demand and the rationale. I've talked about the importance of clarity and there's in that you can have reference to articles, in that you can have references to specific concepts. There's no need to write contract. And I'll say that again. There is no expectation that perfect contract language is going to take shape in the input. There's experts in my section, the negotiator, who work with the bargaining team, and the researchers to develop the contract language. Sometimes we'll rely on contract language that was written before. Sometimes if we need legal support, we'll ask legal, we'll ask the others that need to be engaged. So that's why getting the ideas out there clearly as in plain language with a reference or two is very, very helpful. Clarity is key. When you formulate a demand, take some time to write it. Take some time to sort of put this together, think on it, talk to others in your local. That can really help. Talk to others who may not be engaged in or know about the interest. Ask them, hey, is this something like that could be a way to spark up a conversation, build union power around just a simple chat about bargaining input? Hey, did you know this? Hey, what do you think about this? I wrote this little piece of input. What do you think? Somebody went, oh, I think this. And maybe that person is now going to start coming to meetings and maybe they'll write their own demand. It can build like that just through sort of that collaborating on writing ideas. It's a process that certainly is best done collaboratively. It does not need to be done in isolation. Some of these topics are complex, and other people may have different experiences than you as you were beginning to think about this. And the more you talk about it, you think about it in a different way. Maybe it builds into 2 demands or 3, or sort of related things, or more evidence or rationale pieces. So that leads me to the rationale. So the rationale is important. It explains sort of the why. The demand is this is what we want. This is what needs to change. This is the idea. The rationale is the why. We talk about evidence, but it's the principle behind the demand. What are we trying to achieve? These are questions you can ask yourself. What is the problem that needs to be solved? Why is this a problem that needs to be solved? Sometimes a description of the problem with some background is actually useful context. Why do you think this is needed? Again, I said, what problems is this trying to solve? But if you know members that are affected, let us know. that every little bit, and I think I've kind of mentioned this a little bit, like every little piece, it's like our whole shift is having problems with this. Our whole region struggles with this. Like those are the types of little like tidbits that can really help lead us for like, oh, maybe we need to look into that further. Oh, maybe I'm going to do some more research on. Oh, maybe the team. I can ask the team. The team can go back and probe into that. So those little. This is why I said at the beginning where like I keep the bargaining input booklet from the conference with me throughout the process. As the researcher sitting at the table with the negotiator and the team, I keep that with me. And I know that some of the team members do too, and so does the negotiator. So that, and I say that and emphasize my personal experience with that because it stays. I want pointing to the fact that it stays with us through the process, and that is again, it becomes so important that it's both clear and supported with any evidence that could be provided. So again, what makes a strong demand? I've asked that question almost, I think it's 6 times now, 7 times, and I'm kind of continuing to add it from challenges to momentum to things like campaigns to strong rationale, precedents to members' needs, demands that are and demands that are grounded in overarching principles of unionism, fairness, equity, solidarity. These make strong demands as well. And these concepts, fairness, equity, and solidarity, flow through each of the topics that we've mentioned. Workplace challenges are certainly places to talk about fairness, equity, and solidarity. Member needs talk about these 3 concepts. Campaigns are sometimes built upon them, and therefore momentum built upon them. These concepts. Often the precedents that we're trying to replicate are focused exactly on these ideas of fairness and equity. So these, again, they influence how we write these demands. At the bargaining conference, that is going to be studying the input and the rationale, the input and the demand and the rationale. These are the lenses through which they're going to be having the discussions at the bargaining conference. Looking at it through lenses of the rationale, through a lens of fairness, equity, and solidarity. They're looking at demands that bring us together and to unify on certain topics and not divide. When you're submitting the demand yourself, a sort of final test too, as you're sort of drafting that final part of the input, is asking yourself, how does it promote fairness, equity, and solidarity? That may help the person who's writing the input add a little bit more about whether it's a little extra bit of clarity or that a little extra bit of rationale or thinking about it. Asking yourself these questions could be a very useful sort of final part of the exercise. Demands grounded in union principles are likely to gain the attention at the bargaining conference and generate discussions amongst the delegates at the bargaining conference where priorities are identified. And this is the first time I've mentioned priorities, but this is sort of a process that happens at the bargaining conference where the input that's been grouped into certain topics, whether it's leave or other things, is discussions around priority making begins in that space, and thinking about it that way, and these thinking discussions around fairness, equity, and solidarity are part of that prioritization at the beginning of that prioritization thinking. So, and I know I want to leave room for questions. So, or if there are any, I guess. So I'm going to walk through some examples, some material examples. And I understand that these examples are assembled for this presentation based on demands and rationale in previous bargaining booklets. So it's real demands. These weren't just written for the purposes of the presentation. So I was part of a group that gave this presentation with a component in mid-September. And we kind of, everybody kind of went and studied this. They read the demand out loud, and we kind of talked about whether it's weak or strong. But I'll do that in this case. So here we've talked about sort of the strength of this one, the demand here is bankable overtime. The rationale, more than ever, we are being asked to work OT, and an agreement that allows us to bank it or a portion of it would be great. That's the rationale. So what are the issues with this proposal? What are the issues with this sort of set of this piece of input that has a demand and a rationale? What I suggest here is the demand isn't that strong. What specifically, questions we could ask, what specifically about bankable overtime? What about which overtime? What type of bank? It could be an issue. Is there an issue with how the employer is applying current provisions? Perhaps we should be grieving this rather than change it. It seems like a demand like this could be overlooked due to its non-specificity at a bargaining conference. In some instances, we know that there are overtime banks. So again, this is where we talked at the beginning about what makes a weak proposal. One that seems like we need to enforce the current contract language, which is pretty strong as it already exists. We could certainly have conversations about maybe we need to expand maybe there's a cap on the overtime bank. Perhaps there is only certain types of overtime that are allowed to be that are bankable, and we'd like to expand the scope of the bankability of the overtime. So you can see, like, as we probe a bit further, that where there are weaknesses in the expression of the demand, as well as weaknesses in the expression of the rationale, and some ideas to map it out a bit. So the short of it is I don't think that there's enough information in this example. Remember, and I've said it many times, that clarity and detail will make a strong piece of bargaining input. Another example. So here the demand says, I propose that we fight for a 4-day work week while keeping our salaries. With rising productivity and automation and more automation being proposed, there will be less work, and we should not concede that this means that we should lay people off. Less work, not less people. Also, I propose PSC take control of our pension investment funds. Our pension funds are being used to invest in projects that go against our interests, including offshoring good union jobs and destroying our environment. We must democratize control of our pension. And the rationale, same as in the demand. Is this an example of a weak proposal, a weak piece of bargaining input, weak demand, weak rationale, or strong input, strong demand, strong rationale? There's some interesting concepts here. The proposal for a 4-day week work, but there's two demands. One is for a 4-day work week. One relates to pension. Again, what I would suggest is it's not the strongest demand or rationale. It's a big ask, and perhaps could be achievable in certain cases, but can we negotiate pensions? Pensions is one of those things that is legislatively it's prohibited from bargaining it because it exists in the legislation, exists in a piece of legislation that can't be bargained in that sense. So that's that second part is we've kind of made the federal public, put it more simply, is the federal public service pension isn't something that we negotiate at the bargaining table, and is probably wouldn't make it into the discussion at the conference because of how the legislation that governs the bargaining is written. Similarly, the 4-day work week one, and the rationale when it's put together, there isn't rationale on it. So the easiest way, and I don't want to spend too much more time because there's two more on this, is one demand, one piece of rationale for that demand is the easiest way to think to sort of, I would say, react to this. Clarity and evidence, clarity and detailed information is the best way to approach this. This is interesting stuff, but again, it may not get the traction that the person who put this in would hope it would get, because it lacks that sort of clarity and that evidence, that detailed information. Okay, a third example. Delete Article 43 and combine the entitlements for volunteer and personal leave under one article, personal leave. The rationale, the SV collective agreement combined volunteer and personal leave in 2018, and the TC combined it also in 2018 in specific articles. Combining these two articles in the pay agreement will give PA members the same flexibility and entitlements as the SV and the TC members with regard to personal leave. Here, some of you may recognize this demand. Basically, we're merging two leaves. Again, it's very clearly written. It has very specific detailed information, and it has very clear rationale. We're comparing to another contract. We want to replicate it. It's very well expressed. Strong demand, A+. We did two examples of weaker demands. One example of a strong demand, and here is the final one, final example. So here we have a new article that ensures allowances and premiums within the collective agreement are increased annually at the same rate as the general economic increase. We want to index allowances and premiums to the general economic increases, the wage increases. The rationale here is the collective agreement has several premiums and allowances that have not changed in a significant way over several rounds. For every year that they stay the same, they are eroded by inflation, and the value of the allowance effectively decreases. If we bargain this provision into the collective agreement, these allowances and premiums will maintain their relative value over time, and we'll be able to focus on other monetary proposals in the future. Again, a clear demand with very descriptive and detailed rationale explaining the logic behind the provisions and why that would be useful, as well as just sort of general. It effectively makes the argument around real wage or real premium allowance decreases over time. So I would say, again, a very strong demand. So we started with two examples of weak ones, and these last two are two examples of strong ones, where clarity and detail in the demand and rationale made for strong input. So I want to thank everyone for that. I hope I didn't go too long there. And the last thing I'll say is, don't assume that somebody else is going to submit the input that you were thinking of. Go ahead and do it, because it could make all the difference. And I hope that this presentation sort of gave some tools to help what that could look like. Thank you. I'll stop sharing the screen now.
Great. Thank you so much, Darren.